still have a few people trickling in, but we'll go ahead and get started here. Welcome to the Conservation Sciences Seminar. We're very pleased to have Dr. Robin Roth join us today. Dr. Roth is an associate professor in the Department of Geography, Environment, and Geomatics at the University of Guelph, Canada. She's a political ecologist interested in the relationship between state-led conservation practice and Indigenous peoples with research projects in Southeast Asia and Canada. She currently co-leads and is PI on the Conservation through Reconciliation Partnership, which is a collective effort to support Indigenous-led conservation and transform existing conservation practice to be better aligned with Indigenous knowledge systems, governance, and law. The title of her seminar today is Moving Towards a Decolonized Conservation Practice in Canada, Successes, Challenges, and Opportunities. Before I hand it off to Dr. Roth, I just want to let everyone know that you can put your questions in the chat during the presentation. We'll hold off till the end of the presentation for answering those questions. Also, if you wanted to be bold and do a face-to-face question, feel free to unmute yourself at the end and ask Dr. Roth directly. But without further delay, Dr. Roth, thank you very much for joining us today, and I'll hand it off to you.
Great, thank you, Kieran, for that introduction and for inviting me today. I'm indeed going to talk about Canada, but I brought a Southeast Asian landscape with me behind so that I'm not too far removed from my roots of looking at Indigenous conservation. In that case, it was in the upland area of Thailand. But today I join you from Guelph, Ontario, which is just outside of Toronto, and it's the treaty lands of the Mississauga New Credit, but the ancestral lands of the Adirondack people. So it's always, and actually most significantly to the kind of work that we all do together, it's a dish with one spoon treaty lands, which is really a pre-settlement treaty amongst Indigenous people here to commit to ensuring that the land was well cared for and would continue to provide food when needed, so you wouldn't take more than you needed, etc. So I think that it's a good analogy for us as we all look towards kind of doing a better job at conservation. So I'm going to do a bit of a fast dash and a high-level overview of a few different things. I do really want to get to the Conservation through Reconciliation Partnership because I do think it's a unique model for moving conservation practice forward globally, really, but certainly in North America. And so I wanted to kind of give us an opportunity to look at what we're trying to do there. It's just a 2-year, it's only been about 2 years that we've had the partnership running, a year of which is in COVID land. So we've had to change a few things that we were doing. But before that, I feel compelled to sort of, review the why. Why would we even be talking about decolonized conservation and why would we want to do that? So let me just share presentation for you. I tend to be a hand talker, so this way you don't have to watch me move my hands too much as I go through this. But yeah, so I think that, if anything, for me, when I reflect on sort of what's happened in the last year or so, and I think a number of people have come out and said the same thing, COVID has really allowed those of us who care a lot about nature to focus on the need for this kind of complete shift in how we're functioning in our relationship to nature and really develop a much healthier, more appropriate approach to conservation. So we can't, and those of you who know any of what I've written won't be surprised by this, but we can't, continue to think of conservation as something it's a set of activities that are about nature, right? Or about ecology. It is really about our collective relationship to nature, and that requires consequently expertise, innovative thinking, action in really all areas of our life, right? Our economies, the ways that we conduct our educational practices, our environmental politics, certainly our policies and our management practices. So I feel like we're kind of in an all hands on deck kind of moment. So we can't afford to sort of ignore certain things. We have to bring it all together and really try to act. And I teach professional conservation students as well. We have a conservation leadership professional master's program here, and most of whom have a scientific background, and all of whom they've been in the field for 10 plus years. They come in, and the thing that they are most worried about is getting the public to care, right? It's like that adage of, people aren't going to protect what they don't love, right? And so, today I'm going to argue basically that transformation that we're looking for in society, one that privileges a healthy relationship to nature, can't happen without decolonization. So the impacts of colonization, certainly as expressed through conservation policy, but not limited to conservation policy, are really a collective barrier to success here. So what I want to do first is just kind of review the dark history, most of which should probably be familiar to you, but I feel like it's a necessary, I want to be sure we're all on the same page in terms of some of the reasons why our current mainstream conservation practices need reform. So I think a lot of us, certainly growing up, and even now today, when we see the kind of growth of green and blue protected areas on the world map, it kind of makes us feel happy, like we're making progress. But as usual, I think, the devil's in the details, and national parks aren't actually, happy places for everybody. Not for those unfortunate enough to have been trapped within their boundaries, or for those who've lost their land or their access to traditional lands where they practice ceremonies, where they gather, harvest, and so on. Not for those who no longer have enough land to grow food, or for those whose hunting and fishing economies have become criminal activities. So as I think we're familiar, the kind of concept of a national park is really about creating a safe place for nature, and the dominant idea for that requires the removal of people. And so while certainly nature and conservation exists outside of these spots on the map, right? We have all sorts of regulatory and non-regulatory mechanisms to advance conservation outside of protected areas as well. The protected area remains still the kind of gold standard of conservation. So it's really my focus here in the talk. But as you'll see, not just that, it's also become kind of a really important target in the Canadian context. And it's being used as leverage, kind of almost synonymous with conservation writ large, which has its problems. So here again, you guys are all in the States. I have American origins too. I was just saying my dad was actually born in St. Paul, but I wasn't educated there. So I'm assuming that you guys know this, but this national park model of conservation obviously predates it, right? Cultural taboos, common property regimes, tenure and zoning practices, all that sort of stuff certainly predates the idea of a national park. But the national park, in its embodiment in the Yellowstone model, which was established in 1872, has really had the biggest impact on how conservation is practiced and viewed and implemented really the world over. So it emerged from a really distinct period of time and a really distinct geography that I think we need to grapple with. So European settlers, moved from seeing nature as really threatening and savage to then taming it, and then seeing nature as a place of salvation, a place where they could go to recreate and be healthy. And at the same time, so nature really as a playground, not as a home for certain people. At the same time, there's real anxiety in North America around Europe and their kind of culture, and the idea that nature's cathedrals that were in the landscapes, particularly of the West in North America, were really equal to Europe's kind of cathedrals, and this desire to kind of really attach national parks to an emerging national identity. Embedded in this concept is that human activity, as it had been seen up until that point, was seen as truly antagonistic to nature and something that needed to be removed. Indigenous peoples were seen as not properly respectful of the sort of the beauty of these landscapes, because they kept on, setting fire and doing hunting and doing the other things that they had always done in those landscapes. And so Indigenous people were forcibly removed from these early parks, or run out prior to that through other kind of colonial mechanisms, which I'll get to in a sec. So just a quick kind of review of where this idea of a park or a protected area sort of emerges from. There were other models of conservation in Europe at the time, which were not exported globally to the colonies the way that this model was. And this, of course, isn't unique to the United States. Canada also, our first national park was established in 1895, I want to say, Banff National Park, and it has a similar history, as does, Watershed National Park a few years later, and all the other parks that we've had established up until about 1982 in Canada. And of course, it doesn't stop, unfortunately, in history. We have things globally, so the Masai, Tanzania continues to struggle against a private protected area. And of course, there's evictions happening in India and elsewhere kind of all the time. So it's not really super surprising that there's a degree of mistrust between Indigenous peoples in the conservation sector, and a huge, concern about what conservation means, the word conservation, and certainly protected areas just sort of elicits to this day in Canada an idea that that's just a place that you're not allowed to go for Indigenous communities. So, what makes mainstream conservation colonial? And I've focused in on the national park here, but a similar argument has been made and can be made around our wildlife management practices, which also emerged from a very similar time period in North American history. So the two that I focused on here is really, that conservation has been used to advance claims of the state on Indigenous territory. And those establishment of parks and protected areas have resulted in the direct dispossession of Indigenous people of their traditional territory. So as nasty as that is, and we see examples of it in contemporary forms of conservation as well, private protected areas. In the highlands of Thailand, it was very common for the government to start sponsoring tree planting exercises, which were in the name of climate change, in which they would simply occupy fields that Indigenous people had been using to grow crops in, and so on. REDD, other kinds of international mechanisms, carbon offsets, et cetera, tend to get used by the state to claim Indigenous territory globally. In some respects, they're symptoms really of more profound ways that mainstream conservation has been colonial. And I think there's two sets of processes that are more insidious in some ways and underpin that kind of material dispossession. One is the promotion of Western scientific knowledge and managerial science over Indigenous knowledge systems and governance. So a strong belief in, I guess, belief in that the proper tools of conservation lie in Western science and Western governance. So the state still appears to be the ideal scenario. Regulatory action, of course, over the last 20 years with neoliberalism and so on, there's been increased partnerships around conservation, and the state has weakened its hold on conservation. But nevertheless, kind of Western science and governance tend to be the preferred way of going for the conservation sector. And then the other is really it advances Western ontologies over Indigenous ones. So what I mean by that is certainly Western notions of nature and wilderness as being pristine and untouched. So the ideal nature is one without people in it. That is certainly one aspect of Western ontology that has taken precedence over Indigenous ontologies. But also things like what is considered animate and what is not, right? What's inanimate versus what is animate? What has agency and what doesn't have agency? If we should be focusing on the protection of a thing, or whether that thing is a subject, and what we should really be doing is focusing on the connection between the relationship between one thing and another thing, right? So that ontological difference is something that I'll talk a little bit more about, but I think it's the ongoing challenge here when it comes to transforming conservation practice to be better aligned with Indigenous knowledge and systems. So I like this quote from the Fifth World Parks Congress, an Indigenous representative, where he says, first we were dispossessed in the names of kings and emperors, and later in the name of state development, and now in the name of conservation. So, guess what? Dispossession is not just something that conservation does. It's really at the heart of settler colonialism. And that's the context within which our mainstream conservation practices have emerged. So, so I think, while we can see really material impacts of conservation as a mode of dispossession, and some of these more discursive impacts around the privileging of certain kinds of epistemology, certain kinds of ways of doing and ways of knowing as a form of conservation, I think we also have, or form of colonialism, I think we also have to see how colonialism and conservation really work together and create what I would call, I've referred to here in the slide as our current impoverishment, but it's my assertion that that we have been robbed up until this point of an opportunity to learn of different ways of doing and relating to nature. And so I think our current conservation practice is impoverished because of the ways that conservation and colonialism have interacted over the centuries. So there's kind of four particular things that I want to mention in terms of how these work together. One, of course, is that earlier settlers brought with them this deeply held belief about the dominion of man over all species, right? The superiority of the humans over other species and their rights to consequently exploit them or use them for their purposes. But of course, connected to that, and at the same time as the doctrine of discovery, really the kind of belief that some humans are more human than others because they're more capable of logical scientific thought and good government. And the reason they are capable of more scientific thought and good government and consequently more human is because they're more distant from nature. Okay, so there's a sort of a sense that humans are separate from other species and from nature, and that separateness, the more separate you are, the higher indicator it is that you have the right to govern. And of course, the doctrine of discovery simply established spiritual, political, and legal justification for colonization and the seizure of land that wasn't inhabited by Christians, which of course Indigenous people in the Americas were not. Another mechanism of colonialism that has been used in the conservation world is the spatial control of Indigenous people, so on reserves in particular, but other forms of spatial control as well. And of course, a whole host of assimilation policies, which have resulted in the impoverishment of Indigenous knowledge systems. So as a way of just sort of illustrating, I don't have time, obviously, nor is it the purpose to kind of review Canadian settler colonialism, but just as a way of illustrating the speed at which some of these mechanisms kind of happened, I'm just going to do a quick overview of Blackfoot Territory in southern Alberta and northern Montana, which is one place I've spent a fair bit of time. And I currently have a PhD student who's a bundle holder and a knowledge holder from the Confederacy there. So in the dark green, you have one version of what Blackfoot traditional territory would have looked like pre-settlement. Of course, those boundaries are never as clean as they appear on a map. And then you can see in the orange is actually the, you see that? I guess so. The orange, this is the Blackfeet Reservation in Montana, and this is the Kainai First Nation, which is actually by square footage the largest reserve in Canada. And then the Piikani Nation and Siksika Nation. So those are the 4 tribes of the Blackfoot Confederacy, and that was their traditional territory. And now these are the postage stamps on which they are allowed to survive. And here you have a really rapid kind of history of how that happened. So, and from a Canadian perspective, so I haven't hit all of the stuff that's happening in the States at that time. But you have, first contact actually with Europeans was not that long before. It was in the early 1800s, 1822. And then you have the Indian Act, which was enacted in Canada, which allowed, it wasn't Canada at the time, which allowed, the Crown to have control over Indians and Indian land. They were forced to sign Treaty 7 due to a whole bunch of things, not the least of which is the disappearance, the murder and execution of the buffalo, right, which went from 60 million down to a few hundred in a matter of decades, which was their primary, was the cultural keystone species, their primary life way, really. So Treaty 7 was signed in 1877. The starvation winters happened in 1882 to 1884 because there were no buffalo left. And then you have Mormon settlement come up here in Cardston in 1887. The park, Watershed National Park, was here. That was established in 1887. And then you have the residential school system. So kids sent to schools, taken away from parents. In 1895, the pass system is created in which, and I think this is quite specific to Canada and South Africa, as the case may be, where you were not allowed to leave reserve without permission from the Indian agent, nor was anyone allowed on reserve without permission from the Indian agent. And so they'd have to ask permission to visit family at another reserve, for instance. Permission was often denied. And then in 1910, you get Glacier National Park, which is here. So I think in a really short period of time, you can look just over a period of 3 or 4 decades, you have a peoples who get disconnected from the land and the animals that sustained them very, very quickly, right? And by doing so, and I've heard elders on reserve, and actually not even elders, people my age on reserve in Blackfoot Territory saying, people can't even think outside of the reserve anymore. Like they don't know their territory anymore. And they've heard stories maybe, but they don't know where to find those places where you can get the paint to paint faces, which is one of the ceremonies that they do. And so a real disconnect from that traditional territory. So settler colonialism set out to separate Indigenous peoples from their territory. That's not any news. And in doing so, they suppressed their rights of movement, but also they suppressed their responsibilities. And this is a really key thing that I've learned from the folks that I'm working with. It's not only about rights, it's also about responsibilities. And so they were unable to exercise their responsibilities towards the lands and animals that they saw as part of their responsibility to care. And consequently, the knowledge around how to do that was also suppressed. This separation has resulted in harm to Indigenous peoples, certainly well documented, and also the territories that they cared for. So in the absence of those ceremonies, those traditional harvesting practices, and their active care for land and species, that land and species has suffered. And I would argue that that's impoverished conservation practice. So the systems of knowledge that were wrapped around those practices that can now teach us all about different ways of interacting with nature and feeling connected to it have been marginalized at best and lost in some cases. And so we're in this moment of kind of resurgence. So that's enough about the damage of kind of what colonialism has done. I really want to now talk to how this is being fixed, right? And how we're healing the mistrust that this has caused between Indigenous peoples and the conservation sector, and heal some of the harm that colonialism has done really to land as well as to each other. And so thankfully, over the last few decades globally, there's been a lot of movement in this direction. Things are changing. I thought I would be able to see my clock here, but I can't. So, okay. And there has been for decades kind of a moral concern over the disconnect between sort of who is burdened and who benefits from protected area establishment and from conservation policies. And there's a much stronger recognition that local knowledge, Indigenous knowledge, and stewardship are valuable in conservation. And this really started internationally in about 1982 with the World's Park Congress. And as long ago as 15 years ago in Durban, South Africa, the Durban Accord was very clear about a new era of conservation, one where Indigenous people would no longer be the victims of conservation, but the beneficiaries of it. So this helps to transform kind of a global understanding of protected areas as places that could be governed by other actors, including private entities, Indigenous peoples, local communities, and various kind of shared arrangements. So, in this past 40 years, there's been numerous attempts to include Indigenous peoples and local people into conservation, but you heard the words I just used, include them into conservation. And a lot of these have been criticized for having a fully formed idea of what conservation practice is supposed to be. And then it's like, yeah, you can come and do it just the way I would do it, but go ahead, or maybe we'll pay you a salary, and then that's a benefit, right? Or, hey, we've already got the science here, but if your Indigenous knowledge kind of confirms my science, then that's great. We can say that it agrees together, but the science is sort of used as a way of, as a litmus test to see if the Indigenous knowledge is really real, right? And so these have all been criticized by, taking science as the norm, by kind of also advancing the rights of the state more than Indigenous people, so sort of making it easier for the state to control lands by incorporating Indigenous people into already established practices. So only recently have models emerged where communities of Indigenous people and not governments have taken a visible lead in creating something that they might refer to as a park. And this has helped. Now, obviously, there are areas that have been treated by Indigenous people for a long time in ways that would be compatible with conservation. But I'm saying like a strategic attempt to say, hey, we have our own parks, right? They're Indigenous parks. This has been helped along by the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, in particular, these articles in front of you here, which really speak to the rights of Indigenous people to protect their traditional use of land, their religious and spiritual relationship to land and territory, their knowledge systems and legal traditions. And importantly, the right to decide on development within their own territories. So in the Canadian context, what has happened, again, without getting too much in the weeds, but what has happened is that our Supreme Court has recognized that our Constitution protects Aboriginal rights to land and territory, and Canada, as a signatory of the UNDRIP, has also in some jurisdictions moved to implement that legislation. So which has provided an opening for greater assertion of Indigenous rights and responsibilities outside of reserve land. And so what I'm seeing now in Canada and around the world, a few other places I'm involved in, is Indigenous people really kind of simply asserting their responsibilities, right? They're kind of enacting what they see as their responsibility towards lands, plants, animals, and all the beings that inhabit their traditional territory. They're not necessarily asking for permission from anybody, but simply asserting that they've never lost that responsibility. They're now ready to take it back up again. And I think that's a lesson that mainstream society needs to hear right now. Like, we all have a responsibility to other beings on the planet. And if we fulfill that responsibility, we can have a healthy environments and healthy people, right? So a few examples that are prominent, and you can find them in the literature and stuff in Thailand as well, is of course the Hulkaminni tribal parks in Clayoquot Sound on the west coast of Vancouver Island, where they are on untreated land. So they've never had a treaty with the Crown. They're still subject to provincial and federal rules and regulations. And they're saying, you know what, we're just going to start taking care of our lands, and we've declared these tribal parks, and here's the rules, and this is what you're allowed to do on it, and what you're not allowed to do it, and simply asserted their authority. And they have now 5 tribal parks in their territory. Another example is Luxilke Dene have established Tai Dene Nene, which is called Land of Our Ancestors, a massive area on the east arm of Great Slave Lake in the Northwest Territories in the north. They reached out to Canada after many years of Canada trying to get them to accept a national park. They refused, and then they reached out and said, you know what? You're our best bet for preventing all the mining happening in our territory. So what kind of deal can we strike? And they ended up creating new legislation in the Northwest Territories for Indigenous protected and served areas. They created a trust fund that would fund Luxilke guardians on the land. And they created what would be a tri-jurisdictional park. So national park is a part of it, territorial park is another, and the Luxilke have their own territory that they're exclusively responsible for. And it's all co-managed under new legislation and rules. So these are kind of a couple of examples of what's going on in Canada. And all of these examples are formed in a logic of Indigenous conservation, which is about a reconnection to land and to develop reciprocal relationships to land and its creators and its inhabitants. You know, the Blackfoot also have been not creating a protected area, but reasserting their responsibility towards their cultural keystone species, which is they refer to as the buffalo, we would call it the bison. And they headed up, along with other tribes in the United States, the Buffalo Treaty, or the INI initiative called the Buffalo Treaty. And here's just the clause on conservation in that treaty, which has been signed by many tribes around the Americas at this point. You know, they recognize buffalo as a practitioner of conservation. So we collectively agree to perpetuate conservation by respecting the interrelationships between us and all our relations, including animals, plants, and Mother Earth, to perpetuate and continue our spiritual ceremonies, sacred societies, sacred languages, and sacred bundles, to perpetuate and practice as a means to embody the thoughts and beliefs of ecological balance. A really different definition of conservation than what we're generally thinking of when we think about conservation in protected areas in the Canadian context and arguably elsewhere, right? So this emphasizes the need to continue a language, governance systems, spiritual ceremonies, connections to land. They don't, in this one, they don't talk about harvesting, but they do elsewhere. That it's that and the respect for the animal as being an agent of conservation that's going to get us to the place where we're back in ecological balance, right? It's a really different ontology or different idea around what conservation is. So to sum it up, I would say that you know, mainstream notions of conservation are really about saving the last of nature from humanity, whereas Indigenous conceptions of conservation are about reconnecting humanity and nature, right? And they're done largely to create abundance. The student of mine who's an elder with the Blackfoot Confederacy, you know, she's like, it's really funny that Western conservation doesn't value something until it's really rare. Like, why are you all off trying to save scarce things? Like, we need to value the abundance and then make sure that abundance continues, right? And another elder I work with, he's like, yeah, if you're always thinking about scarcity, you're going to get scarcity. He's like, so if you manage for scarcity, you're going to get scarcity. We can't wait that long, right? Don't wait that long. So now I'm, you know, I hope that gives us a bit of a sense of some of the challenges in terms of the real distinct ideas around what conservation can be or should be, and what will get us to a place where we have the abundance of life on the planet, right? And as an example of that, I suppose when I set out to put together the Conservation through Reconciliation Partnership, I was desperate for an Indigenous scholar to lead it, but no one who did relevant work, and there are a lot of them are involved in the partnership, thought of their work as conservation work, right? It's about water, or it's about land, or it's about animals, or it's about resource management maybe even, but they wouldn't frame it in terms of conservation because it's such a nasty word for their own history. And so that was really interesting to me. And we went with a collective model, which I think is healthier anyhow. So effectively, it was the Conservation to Reconciliation Partnership is really trying to shift us away, as the introduction suggested, away from kind of colonial models of conservation towards ones that are more akin to these kind of indigenous notions of conservation, and to certainly to try to heal the harm that's been done, and also move us forward collectively in a way that allows us to work together and more collaboratively. We can no longer afford to not be working together, right? All hands on deck. So the history of this partnership is really, it's actually a Canadian history to a certain extent. You are all familiar with the HE targets. And what happened, I guess, is Canada decided that HE Target 11, which was about area-based conservation, it was about 17%, right, of terrestrial and 10% coastal marine by 2019. That was their target. Canada just decided that we're going to call that Canada Target 1, Pathway to Canada Target 1. And so what they did is approach a colleague of mine, Eli Enns, who's Tla'aque'eht from the tribal parks that I mentioned earlier. And they said, hey, will you write us a white paper on how Indigenous people can help us, meet our targets? And he's like, yeah, no, no, I'm not going to do that. But if you're serious about Indigenous engagement, then you should let me assemble what he referred to as the Indigenous Circle of Experts. And we will deliver a report to you. And so, so that's kind of the beginning of the policy process in Canada that has led to where we are now. Unfortunately, I'm going to refer this as the ICE report because that's how we've come to term it here, Indigenous Circle of Experts. I know ICE is an acronym that has other meanings, but we're just going to stick with it for today. Humor me. So basically, ICE had to deliver a report outlining how Indigenous peoples could help Canada meet its targets while moving towards nation-to-nation reconciliation in the process. They spent 1 year. They had 4 gatherings. It was a larger group. They had an Indigenous core, but also members of Crown and territorial governments also sat on that ICE, some of whom were non-Indigenous. And they came up with 28 recommendations, which were delivered in March of 2018. So as that's happening, I had always been kind of curious about what decolonized conservation would look like, and are we seeing it in tribal parks and other models that are out there? And I already knew Eli from previous projects. And so I sort of reached out to him. I said, what's going on with this ICE thing? I see it in the news, and the federal government had made big discussions, like make announcements about how, hey, Parks Canada needs to apologize for stuff that they did in the past, and we want to develop better relationships, et cetera, et cetera. So I said, what's kind of happening? And basically through that discussion, we decided to apply for some money because we didn't know at the time what Canada was going to do with these recommendations. They could have like shelved them or ignored them or whatever. And we thought, you know what, like we're just going to move forward with these things anyhow. So we managed to get a bit of money from kind of the NSF equivalent up here for social sciences called the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada, or SSHRC. And then some other funding from our university and others to sort of effectively implement that ICE report. So this is the report called We Rise Together. And they are clear in the report that Indigenous protected and conserved areas represent opportunities to reconnect to the land and to heal both the land and Indigenous peoples. They basically delivered, I think Canada wanted them to say, hey, like, yeah, create IPCA legislation, and then here's a couple of Canada areas, and that'll help you meet your 17%. They didn't do that. The report's available online. Basically, there's 28 recommendations, and they go fairly foundational, sort of things like, you should really look at the original treaties that Canada has failed to uphold historically. There's really good information in there about how we can move forward together and how we should be preserving the lands. And so start with that and start to rebalance that relationship. Not necessarily the message Canada wanted to hear. It certainly wasn't the easiest message to hear, but it actually has been embraced. And so I can talk a bit about that later. But they define IPCAs are lands and waters where Indigenous governments have the primary role of protecting and conserving ecosystems through Indigenous laws, governance, and knowledge systems. And culture and language are at the heart and soul of this IPCA. So the 3 key characteristics is that they have to be Indigenous led. So as it's been explained to me, it's like an Indigenous nation can say, hey, I want to declare an IPCA here, and these are the kind of laws that I want to have used, but I'm going to hire someone who's not Indigenous to do some stuff for me. That's fine. That's all cool. Like, it doesn't really matter. But it has to be led, and the decision making has to stick with the Indigenous nation themselves. If they're like, hey, I want to partner with the federal government on this, that's great, but it has to be led by them. They have to represent long-term commitment to conservation, and they have to elevate Indigenous rights and responsibilities. So this, I'm gonna have to skip this because I'm running out of time. So the other key term in this partnership is called conservation through reconciliation. And as an Indigenous colleague of mine said, she's like, the thing is reconciliation, because at one point we're like, should be reconciliation through conservation. It's like reconciliation can happen in many different ways, but conservation can only happen in one way. And she's like, it can only happen through reconciliation, right? We need to come together, we need to understand each other better, and we have to maintain and create these respectful relationships. The TRC stands for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada. But it's more than that. So it's more than just relationships between each other. It's first and foremost, we have to reconcile humanity's relationship to the earth. And then we have to reconcile Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, and then Indigenous governments and Crown governments. And so that's kind of how we're approaching it in the partnership. It's not a typical university-based research partnership. So there are 3 main partners, 2 of which are Indigenous. The Isaac Olam Foundation is run by Eli Enns, and the Indigenous Leadership Initiative is run by Val Courtois from Labrador. We have a lot of partners, including Crown partners, but also the big, World Wildlife Fund, Ducks Unlimited, TNC, a bunch of different big conservation organizations, some universities, etc. And it's kind of growing all the time. We have 3 main objectives. One is to increase the capacity amongst Indigenous nations and communities, the conservation sector, and the general public. And that's really about like, what is Indigenous conservation? How do we do it? How do we be better partners? Indigenous nations needing, tools that they can use that advance their own value system on their land. So the kind of classic conservation tools don't work so well. And so trying to help create those tools and build that capacity amongst the general sector. And our legacy project here is going to be, I think the first version of it is going to be released this summer. It's called the Solutions Bundle. It's going to be an interactive online site where you can access information, stories, teachings, knowledges about Indigenous-led conservation from lots of different directions. And it's meant to bring together kind of a notion of a toolkit with a more Indigenous notion of a medicine bundle. We're also going to create a lasting network for conservation through reconciliation, which is really knitting together all of the IPCAs, or the Indigenous Protected and Conserved Areas in the country. So they have their own organization, and they will actually hold the Solutions Bundle. And then we're going to create some centers of excellence where collaborative learning and research in support of Indigenous-led conservation can happen. So those are kind of our main objectives. You can see who's on the leadership circle here is myself and Faisal Mullah are the 2 university-based people on the circle, and the other 4 are all Indigenous thought leaders from around the country who were members of ICE. So Eli Enns co-chaired ICE. Stephen Nita is from Lutz-Lacay in the Northwest Territories, he's Dene, and Lisa Young is a Mi'kmaq woman from Nova Scotia who runs the Inamaki Institute of Natural Resources. And Marilyn Baptiste helped found Dasico Tribal Park in the Chilcotin Central area of British Columbia, and she was chief of her nation at that time. And then we have an Elders Council, and the Elders Lodge, sorry, and they have certain roles and responsibilities. The Leadership Circle provides strategic direction. They guide us when asked, and they help support decision-making, ethical oversight, and so on. And then we have our partners, which really do a lot of the work and are trying to kind of knit, we're all kind of knitting our good work together to try to amplify and catalyze change. So making sure we're not replicating efforts, sharing knowledge, and so on. We have 7 streams of work, which, looking at the time, I won't go into great detail on. But they are all co-led or led by Indigenous thought leaders or Indigenous scholars. Notable names that you might already be familiar with is Deb McGregor runs the knowledge systems stream. She's an Anishinaabe scholar. We have John Burrows involved in the domestic law and policy stream, but it's run by Larry Innes. Biocultural indicators and outcomes is run by Faisal with a number of really notable, amazing young Indigenous scholars who are incorporating two-eyed seeing and biocultural work into their own science work. So Andrea Reed, who's a fisheries ecologist, and Jesse Popp, who's a wildlife biologist. And so it's a really great group of people. And also economies, infrastructure, financing. These are big kind of practical things we all have to think about. So the work that happens in these streams gets mobilized through the partnership, and we into the solutions bundle, into the kind of audiences that that need that information, and they respond to inquiries. You know, so nations who are like, hey, I need help with the communication strategy because we have a lot of conflict here, and the cottagers right next to our park don't understand why we're allowed to hunt and they're not, right? So those kinds of inquiries will come through these streams. So I won't be able to show this video, but all this stuff's available on our website. This is Reg Croshu talking about what ethical space is. And this is a key feature of our work. In ethical space in shorthand, because that's all the time I have, is to respect governance arrangements, both Indigenous and Western governance arrangements, and to allow them to work together and create a space of respect in which we operate in both. So as a really clear example of this, and this is about university bureaucracy, but I was hiring an Indigenous elder to advise me on a master's program that I created. And of course, the typical thing happens. There's a letter of offer and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, he's supposed to sign basically saying he's going to do all this stuff for me. And I don't have any responsibility apparently, other than to make sure it gets paid. So we like sat down and looked at that and we're like, you know what, maybe we need to change something here. And he said, well, let's insert something in here that says, hey, you know, this is great. This is great. This is what I'm going to do. But Robin, as my employer, is responsible for upholding a space in which knowledge systems, Indigenous knowledge systems, are respected. I'm responsible for ensuring that I'm responsive to him and his work, and that we're going to do ceremony, right? So the signing of the letter and the ceremony together mean that he's now employed, right? And the university went for it totally, and they're like, oh, I totally get that. And I have to say that participating in the ceremony, in where I had to vocalize my intention towards our collaborative work, was way more meaningful than signing a letter of offer. Two-eyed seeing is the other key way that we're doing our work, and that's really from Mi'kmaq leader Elder Albert Marshall. And quickly, this is about bringing together Western knowledge systems and Indigenous knowledge systems, but not impinging on either. So not integrating one into the other, not elevating one over the other, but taking both of the strengths and those gifts and making them work together for the benefit of all. So it's really about multiple perspectives and maintaining integrity of those knowledge systems. And Elder Albert will also talk about how you have the responsibility to act, right? He's a very action-oriented guy, and he's like, you don't just get to like explore that stuff and then sit on it. It's like you gotta act on it and make change happen. And that's just my favorite quote from him. He's always gone on about how nature has rights, but humans have responsibilities. So we have a bunch of current activities, which I'm happy to answer questions about, but lots of webinars now that we're in COVID world. The solutions bundle, which I've already mentioned. And all of those Campfire series are open. They're webinars that are open to anybody. So if you want to get on the listserv, you can attend some of them. A whole bunch of research. What are the impacts of the kinds of projects that Parks Canada has inside of parks to bring about reconciliation? You know, what kinds of communication strategies do we need to use in order to resolve conflict around protected areas when it comes to Indigenous stewardship? You know, helping nations create management plans for their IPCAs. And I will say that the federal government has now funded 27 proposed Indigenous and protected and conserved areas in Canada. And so there is, you know, there's stuff going on there, and we're trying to support that work. We're assessing key biodiversity area legislation implementation in Canada for its ability to capture Indigenous conservation values. Looking at land-based learning centers as a form of income for IPCAs. You know, what are the outcomes of different kinds of governance arrangements like co-management versus Indigenous-led and so on. We're also creating a bunch of products that will be useful. So a framework for managing protected areas that give value to biocultural indicators. So the kinds of things that matter as cultural keystone species or as important species or places for Indigenous communities. And it goes on, right? So, you know, we're trying to create documents and techniques and tools and tell stories that will help people to advance basically Indigenous land conservation in Canada. But there are some ongoing risks and challenges. Money is always one, but there's a potential here to become over-reliant on the federal government and what the federal government has value for. So they really like those targets, right? If you weren't going to get something on like established in time to be counted, then you may not have got that funding. I still think there's a problem with the protected area framework because it's so area based and it has that baggage that I spoke about earlier, and it eliminates other forms of conservation. This is a complaint from Indigenous nations. They get frustrated. So this happened the other day. We're talking about land trusts, and there's very few Indigenous land trusts in Canada. There's way more in the States, but in Canada, there's very few. And they're just like, really, we have to like buy back the land that was stolen from us. And then we have to fit it into a framework that basically allows the state government to tell us if we're doing a good enough job on conservation or not. And why is it that we can't just be recognized for the stuff that we're already doing? Like, why are we always having to fit into Crown law? Yeah, so the public understanding is still really low. And there's always that risk of co-optation or tokenism. So there's always complaints, and we're trying to prevent this too, but complaints about conservation organizations, for instance, using their relationship with an Indigenous nation to leverage funding into their own organization and not necessarily funding into the Indigenous nation who also needs support, right? So I think in general, revisit those 4 things. There's some progress, but there's also still a lot to be done. And I think that the biggest change is that we've developed a pathway that the establishment of protected areas can stop being about dispossessing Indigenous people of their territory, but actually allowing them to, repossess it, to put it simply, but to reaffirm their own governance systems on their traditional territory. So I know that I've taken a few extra minutes than I wanted, but we still have some time for questions. That's the website that we're currently running. The Solutions Bundle website will be up sometime in the summer, we're hoping. But for now, most of the information I went through today is on there, and I would encourage you to look at it if you're at all interested. And we do have, videos and things like that. So it's not all words, thankfully. So I'll leave it there for now, and happy to answer questions about any of that, or bring up examples, or do a bit of a deeper dive, whatever's of interest to you at this point.
Very cool. Thank you, Dr. Roth. Really do appreciate that. Kind of wish we had 2 hours instead of 1 today. But if anybody had any direct questions that they'd like to ask Dr. Roth, please feel free to unmute yourself and go ahead.
I have a question about the link between semantic knowledge and Indigenous knowledge. Is there a study on that?
Semantic knowledge and Indigenous knowledge?
Yeah, for example, we often hear that native groups that live in the far north have more than 200 words for snow. So that would be an example of a part.
Yeah, well, I think that, one thing that I've been coming to understand, should I stop sharing? Maybe then our pictures can be bigger. There, that's better. Is the importance of the connection of language and the different kinds of Indigenous languages to the territories, and that there's this kind of twin resurgence between, like, we actually have 3 Indigenous PhD students on the project, all of whom are looking at that connection, because they feel the need to reclaim that language and the nuance that it brings to the kinds of environments that language grew up in is critical to their ability to understand that territory the way that their ancestors did. So yeah, I do think that there's a connection to that. I'm not intimately familiar with how they're thinking about that, but it is linked, right? And I think that's one of the biggest challenges. Like I talked about that biocultural indicators framework. We tend to measure success in conservation, at least Canada does, in terms of like acres that are inside of a protected area, level of connectivity. There's some qualitative indicators now, but you ask Indigenous folks, like, what would success look like? And they're like, we'd be using less drugs. We would have more language in our communities in these that they want us to keep a tag on, right? Like, hey, if Indigenous communities their languages are coming back, their social ills are starting to go away, more of them are employed, lower diabetes, like those are conservation indicators for them. And that's one of the challenging things with the conservation sector. They're not really programmed to think about collecting data on the resurgence of Indigenous languages. But if you think of it if you think in the way that they do about connection and connectivity to territory, then those become really important indicators. So yeah, I don't know if that helps, but I think you're onto something there in terms of the nuance of the language is part of the knowledge system that grew up around the governance of that territory.
Any more direct questions for Dr. Roth? Otherwise, we have a couple in the chat. I'll maybe give a couple seconds for somebody to hop in here.
I know we're so used to screens now.
I know, right? Yeah, hopefully we'll be getting away from them soon here. But yeah, so there is a question in the chat. Dr. Roth, thank you for sharing. I wonder if you could comment on the heterogeneity across different Indigenous belief systems. Are there widely shared ontologies, or does it vary greatly across region, tribe, nation?
Yeah, I think this is a really important question and one that we grapple with a lot. So even the term Indigenous only has meaning in relation to colonization, right? It otherwise doesn't have meaning. And so, you know, practically, we try fairly hard to identify which Indigenous nation we're talking about because there are differences, certainly in terms of language and culture. But there are also some similarities, or at least enough of a similarity that people are okay with kind of talking in more general terms. And that, you know, and there's different ways of thinking about this, but for me, that kind of relational ontology is one that's very common in Indigenous societies. There may be exceptions to that, but even the folks that I've worked with in Thailand and Burma and Vietnam, and they have very similar ontology. The ones who are still very closely related to land, and I think that that's you know, so that's why I said there's different ways of thinking about it. I think that some of that relational thinking emerges from anybody who has long history relating to land and depending on land for their immediate survival, right? But as some of the elders I've talked to about this will say, they'll say, well, one of the differences between, you know, farmers who've been farming for their generations, like 7th, 10th generation farm on the same farm, that they have detailed knowledge about that land. They don't always have the same spiritual or reverential connection to that land is what he told me. And I think I can see his perspective there as well, that there's still a bit of a managerial relationship to that land, not one where you spend time actually listening to what the land's trying to tell you, right? Because that's kind of what they're talking about. But I think amongst most Indigenous peoples that I have had the honor and ability to interact with, I would say that that idea of relationships being more important than objects is kind of common. And you see that in the languages. I mean, back to the language, I actually haven't learned an Indigenous North American language as of yet, but I'd like to, because I understand that most of them are very verb based, right? So it's all about action and things coming into being. Whereas we're very noun, like English and German are very noun based languages. And I think that really changes how you think about things. And so you know, we need a linguist on board, but like someone who can speak to that, like the kinds of languages that emerge out of certain kinds of human environment relationships and how that structures how you think about nature, I think is a really interesting area. But yeah, so I'd be very careful politically, you know, trying to assert too much similarity between different Indigenous tribes. But I think there are some shared ontologies. So we're trying to kind of do a bit of both. Like that solutions bundle, when it comes up and running, we're trying to have like your IP address indicate where you're logging in from, and you would hear a language from that area and probably a welcome song from that area. But then the information within it would likely be fairly generic. So you'd have to adapt it. Any Indigenous nation picking up, like say the biocultural indicators framework we're creating, it's meant not to tell them how to do their job, but as a starting point so they can take that framework and say, okay, what matters to me? What's the process I can follow to make this work for our particular location? So we always have to work in that framework where it's about start with what is general and then allow nationhood to really figure out how to use those tools for that reason. Yeah, I mean, ecologies are different too, right? So yeah.
Hi, great talk, Dr. Roth. I've observed in other countries, Indigenous people, Native people adopting a protected area framework or operating within that. And I'm wondering, have you encountered that in your own work and is that kind of, you know, adopting a misplaced kind of perspective, or how have you dealt with that challenge where you're seeing, you know, Native or Indigenous people embracing what would be the colonial perspective from your argument?
Yeah. it does happen for sure. I think sometimes it happens very strategically. So there's like a political reason why that's the best route for them to go. And so I wouldn't begrudge them that by any means. I've had an interesting conversation. So how I approach it is I tend to just is through conversation, especially when I'm in a place that I don't know very well. I mean, regardless, I guess. But I remember having conversations in Thailand about that sort of thing. And some of those conversations led to for me to understand a lot better. So for instance, as a young PhD student, I'd read a lot, as we all do, and then you go off into the field, and I was shocked and amazed to see that because I was sort of so it went both ways. So I remember I was trying to map actually the folks behind me here. I was trying to map their land, and I was asking them, where their land ended and something else began, and they're like, "Yeah, you're crazy. It doesn't. It's all nature. We all just share it. What are you talking about?" So I was like, "Oh yeah, right." So then I finally go to the other side, but then I found out that they actually did have really hard boundaries around certain things. So like the ceremonial forest was kind of a taboo forest. You don't go in there. It is not for people. End of story. Like you go in there, if someone dies, and that's it. And so then I really, because I had this theoretical slant that was like Cartesian space is all about, the European Empire, and it doesn't exist, in indigenous communities, but it does. You're like, oh yeah, right. It does. So it's not that those ideas don't even exist within their own cultural system. They tend to just not use them the same way that we've used them. And so that was one part of the learning. The other is sort of saying, hey, that's really interesting. You've made that decision. Totally yours to make. This is what someone else I know is doing over there. Have you guys thought about that? And then you end up with this other really interesting conversation. So, where people are obviously empowered to do what they want in their own territory, but to do so without the privilege of hearing about other possibilities would be unfortunate, right? So I generally see that as my kind of role. An example in of kind of both, I guess, is the Salween Peace Park in what we refer to as Burma or Myanmar. It's Karen State. Recently won a bunch of international awards, actually, but they basically took this peace park idea and said, okay, we're going to use that. Like we're going to use that idea, and we're going to have hard boundaries, and we're going to have rules and regulations, and it's going to look really like it's going to be very easy for people, outsiders, conservationists, to understand what we're trying to do here, because they felt they needed to protect that territory from the Burmese government, right? And they're very conscious about it. They're like, if we're not going to ask their permission because they're not going to give it to us. They want China to come in here and mine it. So we're not going to talk to them. We're going to talk to the international community. And in order to do that, we got to establish something that makes sense to them. And so, but they've done that at the same time that they've tried to reach back into their own history and figure out what their governance arrangements should look like, and to reassert some of those traditions, and to explain that, planting fields like this are, as long as done under certain conditions, are actually helpful for the environment, et cetera, et cetera. So it's kind of a bit of both, but yeah, I mean, if that helps. But it is, it's important to not overly romanticize, right? The idea is that, and to always keep an eye towards that, and to figure out what's going on in terms of the politics of the matter. And for me, to not over essentialize that any one group of people inherently are going to be one way or the other, like to really just figure out what's going on the ground and how to support the stuff that you see as valuable, right? As a scholar or as a conservation practitioner.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. So we are right at 1 o'clock. There is just one other question in the chat, which I think might be a good closing question. And this is from Marissa. It says, Dr. Roth, thank you very much for such a wonderful presentation. Are there opportunities with your group for research partnerships outside of Canada?
Yeah, it's interesting. I was talking to some colleagues in okay, so there are. The quick question is there are. I mean, our funding is from Canada, but Indigenous nations cross the border. So the Blackfoot Confederacy is cross-border. The Haudenosaunee, the Mohawk, right, are cross-border. And so if you start from the principles of the nations themselves and who they need to help do whatever, then they get to choose whoever they want to have help. And if we have some American scholars on the project, some of whom are working directly with nations. So we do have an American ethnobotanist working with the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. I have a really close colleague who's done the work of the Blackfoot with me, who's now at Ohio State University. And so she and I will continue to work together. I think, and then there's a conversation that I'm trying to get started around, which is a bit more of a scholarly conversation, but it is indeed around kind of what decolonized conservation looks like in different places, maybe not even settler colonial places, So I think from that conversation, there will be opportunities to get involved in that kind of broader discussion. And that discussion is going on, don't get me wrong, but in a particular way, as far as I'm concerned. So I'd like to see more Indigenous voices in that for sure. And I have to give that some thought, but we do have a very active student community that's trying to link master's and PhD students together that are working on similar things so they can have some co-learning, but we also do some summer kind of institute sort of training type stuff with them as well, and that could very well be open to other individuals. So generally, when people join the partnership, we try to develop some kind of reciprocal relationship, so a real sense of like what they're going to get and what they're expecting from the partnership, and then what they're also willing to give. So scholars in particular, people who are doing degrees, are asked to provide summaries of their works that can be accessible to others, and those summaries can be video, they can be podcasts, they can be lots of different things, as well as like blog posts and things like that, as well as create kind of tools that can be generalized outside of the community they're working with for other communities to be able to pick up and take on. So yeah, I mean, that's sort of a fuzzy answer, but yeah, it's a bit of a watch this space and see where the opportunities arise. We're trying to create a stronger international linkages right now. We do have that international policy stream, which is looking specifically at how Canada represents itself internationally. But there's a wider variety of people involved in that stream of work as well in terms of their geographic location. Yeah.
Great. Thank you again very much, Dr. Roth. Definitely appreciate you joining us today. Yeah, thank you everyone for joining us. We will look forward to seeing you all again next Friday.
Great. Thanks, everyone. I really appreciate the opportunity to chat. And don't hesitate to reach out via email or whatever if you have further questions you want to ask. Okay. Thank you.